Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The End of Ambition, the United States and the Third World in the Vietnam Era, by Mark Atwood Lawrence. Narrated by Jim Seybert. Publisher's note: in this audio edition you will hear references to figures present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Introduction. As the presidential race heated up in the summer of 1960, few politicians embodied the spirit of the moment so well as Frank Church. The Democrat had been elected Idaho's junior senator just 4 years earlier, handily defeating Republican incumbent Herman Welker, an old-school conservative known for fervent anti-communism. Church left no doubt of his own hostility to the Soviet Union. No viable contender for high office could have done otherwise at a time when anti-communism, even if it had cooled since the Red Scare of the early 1950s, remained an American preoccupation. But Church, like other liberals in his party, promised to wage the Cold War with greater subtlety, vision, and vigor than the Republicans had done in the Eisenhower years. Like his friend, John F. Kennedy, the 36-year-old Church exuded youthful vigor and intellect, precisely the qualities that Democrats were eager to contrast to Eisenhower's elderly torpor. And, like Kennedy, Church spoke passionately of the need for a fresh, activist brand of leadership prepared to mobilize the nation's prodigious power, wealth, and know-how to meet rapidly metastasizing challenges at home and abroad. Church was especially concerned with the Cold War in regions variously called the underdeveloped, less developed, or Third World. Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America were, Church believed, undergoing an epoch-defining transformation that required Washington's urgent attention. Colonialism and other forms of oppression that ensured Western dominance over much of the globe appeared to be crumbling, and non-white peoples were asserting themselves in international affairs as never before. The prevailing order of the last 3 centuries has been destroyed, Church declared in his keynote address at the 1960 Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles. Nothing less than the outcome of the Cold War seemed to hinge on whether the Democratic West or the Communist East responded more effectively. These underdeveloped and uncommitted nations are the no-man's land on which the destiny of the human race will be decided, Church told the convention delegates and a nationwide television audience. Castigating the Republicans for propping up colonialism, coddling friendly dictators, and furnishing military equipment to help suppress popular demands for justice, the Idahoan promised that his party would do things differently. Under a Democratic administration, he pledged, the United States would work with rather than against the forces of progress. It would build democracy and craft ambitious programs not to equip authoritarians with the latest weaponry, but to fill stomachs and fuel development. A little more than a decade later, Church ruefully admitted that all of this, the grand aspirations to cultivate democracy, promote prosperity, and align the United States with the yearnings of people struggling against oppression, had come to nothing. 10 years ago, Church declared in a Senate speech on October 29, 1971, the leaders of the United States, and to a lesser degree the American people, were filled with zeal about their global goals. With supreme confidence both in our power and capacity to make wise and effective use of it, he added, Americans had proclaimed the dawning of a new era for the impoverished masses of mankind. Nonetheless, Church lamented, we have not only failed to accomplish what we set out to accomplish 10 years ago, we have been thrown for losses across the board. The United States had watched as free governments gave way to military dictatorships in country after country. Worse, Church added, 10 years of voluminous economic aid had failed to raise up impoverished nations, while disparities of wealth between rich elites and the masses in many nations had widened. Calling American aid programs a proven failure, Church urged that they be ended. The larger lesson he drew from this dismal record could hardly have contrasted more starkly with his optimism just a few years earlier. Even with enormous power and the best of intentions, he asserted, there are some things we cannot do, things which are beyond our moral and intellectual resources. Church's two speeches neatly capture the trajectory of U.S. policymaking toward the Third World during the 1960s. In the first part of the decade, many Americans, not least their dynamic young president, joined Church in viewing the transformation of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America as their nation's biggest foreign policy challenge, and embraced the tasks of promoting political and economic change. To those people in the huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery, Kennedy declared in his grandiloquent inaugural address, we praise our best efforts to help them help themselves for whatever period is required. Committed to the quintessentially liberal idea that the nation's power must be mobilized to solve problems at home and abroad, Kennedy aimed to pump resources into the Third World and promote political and economic change in areas that had seldom ranked very high in American priorities. Within a few years, however, much of this energy and ambition had drained away. Enthusiasm for foreign aid had dwindled, as did efforts to spread democracy. The election of 1968 signaled the collapse of the earlier vision, bringing to office a new president, Richard Nixon, who showed little interest in the transformation of poor nations. For years, we in the United States have pursued the illusion that we alone could remake continents, Nixon declared in a speech on Halloween 1969. We have sometimes imagined that we knew what was best for everyone else, and that we could and should make it happen. Well, experience has taught us better. Speaking privately with an aide, Nixon made clear where he wished to focus his efforts. The only thing that matters in the world, said the president, is Japan, China, Russia, and Europe. Nixon's top foreign policy lieutenant, Henry Kissinger, felt the same way. The Third World has not proved to be a decisive arena of great power conflict, Kissinger wrote in 1969. Under what the media took to calling the Nixon Doctrine, Washington aimed merely to promote pro-American stability in the Third World, even if it meant bolstering unjust political and economic arrangements. Why did American leaders reverse their approach to the Third World in such a short span of time? Answering this question promises to contribute new insight into U.S. history during one of the nation's most tumultuous and consequential eras. Historians have long written of the 60s as a time when large numbers of Americans, inspired by a surging sense of moral purpose and technical know-how, worked to address their society's abundant imperfections, including poverty, racism, materialism, and ignorance. Equally, the 60s stand out for the disappointments and divisiveness that engulfed much of this high-minded agenda in the latter half of the decade. Far less appreciated is how the trajectory of efforts to address problems within U.S. borders ran parallel to foreign policy. Exploring the history of decision-making toward the Third World during the 1960s highlights continuities between America's domestic and international experiences and contributes to a more complete understanding of the process by which American liberalism fractured and gave way to a new political era that took shape in the 1970s. The United States still commanded monumental power, but the 1960s clarified the limits on Americans' ability to transform their own society or the wider world. Appreciating the shift in U.S. foreign policy during the 1960s also helps to explain the broad contours of global history in the years since 1945. The Second World War accelerated the disintegration of colonial empires and energized non-white peoples of the world by weakening the imperial metropoles and stirring appeals to the principles of self-determination, human rights, and unfettered economic exchange. old hierarchies persisted in some areas, but starting in the late 1950s, the independent nations of Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America asserted themselves as never before, while numerous colonial territories, especially in Africa, claimed their independence. This epoch-defining process, a watershed arguably more profound than either the start or the end of the Cold War, redrew the map of the world and confronted the great powers with a host of new challenges. The reaction of the United States, by far the world's most powerful nation, to this revolution in global affairs was bound to shape both the way in which the process played out and the nature of the new international order that emerged. In the early 1960s, American leaders such as Kennedy and Church responded to ferment in the Third World with determination, at least rhetorically, to reorient U.S. foreign policy toward winning the loyalty of emerging nations and integrating them into the American-led order that prevailed outside the communist bloc. Their inability to achieve those goals marked a singular failure of U.S. policy, with implications for international relations long after the Cold War ended. Rather than aligning the United States with bold socio-political change, Washington increasingly sought to bolster existing sources of stability, whether colonial regimes or postcolonial governments that promised to prioritize partnership with the West above other objectives. Following this course, the United States often tied itself to repressive political forces and alienated itself from governments that refused to toe the U.S. line. American leaders lost opportunities to establish a world order more amenable to U.S. leadership over the long term, and perhaps more just and peaceful, than the one that came into being after the rush to independence and self-assertion that peaked in the 1960s. To be sure, this shift in American policy was hardly unreasonable or driven by malevolent designs. The turn away from dynamic engagement with the Third World made eminent sense amid the turmoil of those years and the staggering demands on U.S. resources from nations that often defied U.S. policy preferences. Still, with the benefit of hindsight, American decisions stand out for engendering doubts, both abroad and at home, about the morality of U.S. foreign policy and Washington's claims to global leadership. Making sense of those doubts may help us appreciate the global position of the United States, so often vexed by tensions with poor nations of the global South in the later 20th and even 21st centuries. Given the pivotal importance of the Third World's transformation during the 1960s and the American response to it, the contours of U.S. decision-making have attracted surprisingly sparse analysis over the years. One reason is the paucity of U.S. documents until the 1990s and early 21st century, when the bulk of American records from the later 1960s became available to researchers. A second reason is the notable aversion among historians, including those studying international affairs, to examine global trends and generalize about U.S. foreign policy. Such caution emerges at least in part from laudable concern that geographic breadth might come at the expense of appreciating distinctions between foreign societies and exaggerating the centrality of the United States. Accordingly, historians have usually focused on bilateral interactions between the United States and individual nations, a tendency that has yielded valuable insights and deeply researched studies on particular relationships, but less analysis of global trends. Another reason for the lack of attention to American policymaking toward the Third World is the overwhelming amount of attention that one small part of it, Vietnam, has attracted. By one reckoning, the Vietnam War has been the subject of more than 30,000 nonfiction books. This outpouring is surely justified by the war's momentous significance to the social, political, and cultural history of the United States, not to mention the larger international history of the 20th century. But controversies about the war have distracted attention from other aspects of U.S. foreign policy that also had a great, perhaps greater, impact on the global position of the United States over the long run. Trajectories of Brazil, India, and other major countries of the Third World turned out to be at least as significant to American policymaking as the expansion of communism in Indochina. Even if the Vietnam War was the central geopolitical event of the 1960s, though, widening the geographical lens to examine what else was happening throughout the world reveals how the U.S. preoccupation with Vietnam affected Washington's relationships with other nations of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, one of the few consequences of the war to remain largely unexamined. The End of Ambition takes up the challenge of examining U.S. foreign policy toward the Third World in the 1960s, arguing that the Vietnam War played a crucial role in leading U.S. leaders to abandon their liberal preoccupations in favor of a more cautious approach aimed at ensuring stability. The war had this effect partly because it demanded so much of America's military and economic resources, making politicians and policymakers wary of assuming additional burdens and anxious to minimize risks in other areas of the world. As the war in Vietnam dragged on, mounting frustration sapped much of the confidence about development and democratization that informed American policymaking at the start of the decade. The war also undermined the liberal agenda by fueling sharp criticism of the United States in many parts of the Third World, making it difficult for sympathetic officials in Washington to defend generous policies toward areas that increasingly seem to defy American desires. All of these trends grew more evident as the Johnson presidency advanced and came to a head in the Nixon years, when U.S. leaders explicitly turned away from the policies embraced a few years earlier. Unquestionably, memoirists and scholars have contended over the years that the war left little time for other international challenges. LBJ's Deputy Secretary of State George Ball made the point deftly in his memoir, noting that U.S. leaders' obsession with Vietnam progressively constricted their vision everywhere else. The metaphor I thought most apt, added Ball, was that of a camera, focused sharply on a small object in the immediate foreground but with no depth of field, so that all other objects were fuzzy and obscure. Scholars have tended to make the point more bluntly. Because of the Vietnam imbroglio, American policymaking toward other regions ground to a virtual halt by 1968, claims historian Thomas J. Knorr. Historian H.W. Brands agrees, asserting that by the end of his presidency LBJ had given up on most of the world, while Stephen Grabard goes so far as to say that after 1965 there was no United States foreign policy. There was only a Vietnam policy. This book is the first to examine such claims by exploring in detail how the preoccupation in Southeast Asia affected other American relationships in the Third World. It is too simple, though, to argue that the war by itself caused the transformation that this study explains. At least 3 other developments would have driven significant change in U.S. policy, even if no American troops had set foot in Southeast Asia. These developments, changes in American leadership, the rapidly shifting political landscape within the United States, and accelerating polarization in the Third World, were already visible in 1965 when Johnson dramatically escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and their course after that fateful year was not shaped solely by the war. Rather, the conflict in Vietnam acted as a powerful accelerant, energizing the other trends, leading the United States to reappraise its foreign policies and ensuring that the total effect of those changes came to more than the sum of their individual potentials. The effect of the war on the liberal underpinnings of U.S. foreign policy thus ran in parallel to its impact on domestic affairs, where controversy over Vietnam intensified social and political upheaval that steadily eroded policy initiatives that had been embraced by a broad swath of Americans at the start of the 60s. The first trend, catalyzed by the war, was the declining influence of U.S. policymakers sensitive to sociopolitical change in the Third World, and the rise of others with far less interest in the issue. Understanding this pattern depends on appreciating the outlooks and decision-making styles of leaders at the pinnacle of the U.S. bureaucracy. This book offers fresh appraisals of the three presidents who, along with their senior aides, compose its core dramatis personae. It argues that President John F. Kennedy genuinely sought to grasp the political and economic transformation playing out in much of the Third World, and sincerely aspired to recast U.S. policy to swim with what he regarded as the inevitable tide of history. But Kennedy, like the advisers who surrounded him, never settled on a coherent approach and left behind an inconsistent and even confusing record. For his part, LBJ lacked both Kennedy's interest in the Third World and his patience for debate about American policy. Although a committed reformer in the domestic arena, LBJ had no such impulse in the international domain. He abandoned much of JFK's agenda, and particularly as the Vietnam War became a major preoccupation, sought to ensure stability in the Third World in order to minimize distractions from his higher priorities. In this way, Johnson anticipated, more than scholars have acknowledged, the approach embraced by Nixon and Kissinger after they moved into the White House in January 1969. Indeed, this book argues that the Nixon administration did not so much conceive innovative policy departures, as both admirers and detractors have long credited it with doing, as articulate ideas that had been embraced during the Johnson years. This book thus highlights the predilections of individual presidents, underscoring how personal experiences and idiosyncrasies drove policy choices. The differences among the men in the Oval Office mattered a great deal. The book also, however, assigns importance to the outlooks of the subordinates, who often decisively shaped policy. More specifically, it views U.S. decision-making as the product of debate among competing factions of policymakers. Although U.S. officials during the Kennedy and Johnson years broadly accepted that the Third World presented momentous challenges, they differed markedly in their sense of how the United States should respond. Conflict was particularly acute during the JFK years, but as the latter chapters of this book show, persisted into the Johnson period. To be sure, this study demonstrates that presidents set the parameters within which conflict occurred. The predispositions at the top of the decision-making hierarchy constrained the jockeying at lower levels by empowering some factions and weakening others. Yet second- and third-tier bureaucrats often exerted significant authority, not least because presidents only intermittently paid attention to the details of policy toward Third World nations. There was thus ample opportunity for lower-level officials to control day-to-day policy implementation. The second trend that drove U.S. policymaking toward the Third World was the transformation of American domestic politics during the 1960s. During the first half of the decade, Americans backed liberal reform projects as never before, targeting racial segregation, poverty, and other problems whose solutions seemed within reach for a nation endowed with limitless power, prosperity, and knowledge. Yet the 1960s also yielded a powerful surge of conservatism as the pervasive optimism of the early years gave way to disappointment and division. By 1965 or so, large numbers of Americans were growing weary of liberal reformism and coming to fear that rapid social change threatened their livelihoods and social mores, trends that only intensified under the pressure of political controversy stirred up by the U.S. escalation in Vietnam. This book argues that this transformation, as dramatic as any that played out in so short a period of time in all of American history, had profound consequences. As urban unrest, anti-war protest, and backlash against the perceived excesses of the Great Society fueled hostility to the Johnson administration, policymakers became increasingly wary of costly policies that seemed to invite even greater criticism of the administration if they were not scaled down. Fully cognizant of the shifting political tide, LBJ abandoned what enthusiasm he still had for efforts to revamp U.S. policy toward the Third World, diverted funds from aid programs that had been hallmarks of Kennedy's New Frontier, and grew notably tolerant of authoritarians who promised to serve U.S. interests. Richard Nixon, free of any attachment to the ambitious goals laid down by JFK or the Democratic Party more generally, completed the reorientation of policy after taking office, especially by explicitly avowing policies that had already been adopted in practice. The third trend that contributed to the transformation of U.S. policy in the Third World was the marked decline of sympathy for the United States across much of the globe during the 1960s. Mounting hostility to U.S. involvement in Vietnam was one major cause of this tendency. Across the Third World, many nationalist leaders castigated the United States for wreaking destruction on an impoverished society and backing an unsavory autocracy in Saigon. Washington was guilty of all types of crimes, including genocide in Vietnam, asserted one declaration of Third World leaders in January 1966. Even among Third World nations that remained aligned with the United States, leaders such as the Shah of Iran and the fiercely anti-communist military officers who wielded power in Brazil sometimes sniped at U.S. decision-making and permitted criticism of Washington as a way of demonstrating their independence from the United States. But other factors, some of them visible before Washington became consumed with Southeast Asia, contributed as well to rising anti-Americanism. Most importantly, the accelerating Sino-Soviet competition for leadership among the revolutionary movements in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America drove both communist powers to emphasize their radical commitments and to step up support for anti-Western forces in various places. The benefits of hindsight reveal the limits of Soviet and Chinese capabilities to expand their influence around the world. Above all, the start of China's Cultural Revolution in 1966 significantly blunted Beijing's ability to project power beyond its borders. But the communist powers' revolutionary rhetoric, along with the rise of Third World governments inspired by their support and examples, fueled anti-Western militancy in many places. Meanwhile, the non-aligned impulse that had once inspired some Third World leaders to seek a genuine third way outside the Cold War blocs lost traction. Polarization flowed partly from a series of coups that jolted several countries sharply to the right during the 1960s. Various forces, meanwhile, led other nations in more radical directions, tilting Third World forums against the United States and encouraging cooperation among anti-Western forces in societies as varied as North Vietnam, Cuba, and Angola. The death or downfall of charismatic Afro-Asian leaders such as India's Jawaharlal Nehru and Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, towering figures who led their nations to independence and championed the non-aligned ideal, opened the way to more confrontational alternatives. So too did frustration with the slow rate of economic progress within newly independent nations and festering geopolitical tensions among them. Conflict between India and Pakistan, Iran and Egypt, and Indonesia and Malaysia shattered the notion of a united Third World operating independently of the great powers. By the mid-1960s, U.S. leaders saw few indications of the political moderation that they had sought to encourage through patient cooperation. The Johnson administration distanced itself from governments hostile to the United States and warmed up to friendly regimes that promised partnership in an increasingly hostile world. The distinct possibility that some Third World nations might soon acquire nuclear weapons only heightened U.S. determination to find more reliable.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?